Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
If you enjoy our show and you find our research interesting, please leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Something that small really does go a long way in helping us out. You can find more about us and the research that we do by heading over to Instagram and searching our name. As always, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
This audio presentation contains graphic details of death, violence, and other controversial subjects. Listener discretion is strongly advised. From Dead Souls Media, this is The Quiet Man. I'm Jamie Black, a researcher and psychologist, and I'll be your host for tonight.
I'm an only child to a single mom. There was just the two of us when I was growing up. Some people think that means I missed out, but I really didn't. I had a great childhood and my mom had a well-paid job, so I never missed out on anything. My grandparents lived right next door too, and I saw them almost every day, so I definitely had it better than some. I was lucky, really. I grew up in Salinas, California. A beautiful city, but absolutely nothing to do when I was a kid. Me and my two best friends had to make our own fun back then. I never knew my dad. He walked out on my mom before I was born, but I'm fine with that. They were young. My mom was 17 when she had me, still a baby herself.
This is Hannah. She's one of our listeners who got in touch a few months back. Hannah reached out with a story that she wanted to tell. While she wanted to tell me what she had experienced, she was also very reluctant for her story to air on the podcast initially. This is quite common for us. Over the years that we have been producing the show, we have had many people reach out with entirely extraordinary encounters and experiences who are often content in gaining our insight, though they are entirely opposed to having their story air for the world to listen to. But that's completely fine, and we welcome friends who feel this way, as well as those who want our audience to hear their experiences. Hannah, do you believe in aliens? Do you think they are visiting us here on Earth?
No, not at all, and absolutely not.
So in that case, what did you experience?
With my hand on heart, I honestly don't know. I want to give you a rational explanation. God knows I have gone over it in my head enough over the years, but I just can't explain it.
So in that case, would you consider it something entirely normal?
Again, no. It was far from normal or explainable.
When Hannah first reached out back in April, her initial email gave me proper chills. We spoke quite regularly back and forth over the subsequent months, as she gradually opened up and shared more and more of her story with me. Hannah is super friendly, and it's impossible not to like her. And when she found out that I was going to be in Los Angeles back in September, she offered to drive down and meet me in person. Hannah lives in Portland now, and that's no small road trip for her to make, so I couldn't tell you how appreciative I was of the effort that she made just to meet with me and my team.
I'm totally cool with you guys sharing my story and telling your listeners what I experienced. Although, I'll be entirely open here, I'm a nervous speaker, so if it's okay with everyone, I would like to read from sheets that I have prepared.
I think this might possibly be one of the strangest and creepiest stories that we have had on the show so far, and that's saying quite a lot. It's a story that touches on a well-established element of the American cultural psyche, which has been a prominent part of the zeitgeist for over 70 years. A true blue UFO case, but one that goes much further than the average encounter. So Hannah won't mind me sharing that she's 42 years old, and that her story takes place when she was just 8 and living at home with her mum on the outskirts of Salinas, California in July of 1990.
You know, there were over 40 people who witnessed it and reported it on the first night, I heard. It was July 4th, so all eyes were on the sky. We certainly weren't alone in what we saw. I was too young to really be scared. I was more mesmerized by what I was seeing than anything else. I definitely wasn't really sure what I was looking at. It took a short while to register what I was seeing. I was old enough to sense that my mom and grandparents were scared by what was happening, and it was that awareness that upset and frightened me the most.
Like everyone else in the country, Hannah and her family were having a barbecue to celebrate the 4th, and her grandfather was letting off some fireworks as her mother and grandmother cooked the hot dogs and burgers over the grill. The sun had just set, so it was around 8:30 p.m. Hannah's house wasn't a farmhouse, but they did have a little bit of land. Her grandparents' house was on the same property, which was great for her as a kid, she says, as it meant having all of her family in one place. Her whole world at that age sat there in just 4 acres of land. At the back of the property, there was a pretty large wooded area, which split the property from a small lake beyond the trees. The place wasn't super rural, but it was around 1/4 mile from the nearest neighbour. It was really hot that night, and the air was dusted by the smell of gunpowder and sulphur. The distant crackling and hiss of fireworks across the valley gave off a gentle soundtrack to an almost perfect evening. There was a very gentle breeze in the air, but even with the sun having gone down, it was still a beautifully warm summer's evening.
I remember running around with a sparkler in hand, carefree, and my grandmother calling out to me, telling me to slow down and not run with the sparkler lit. It was my grandmother who saw it first. She kind of stopped in her tracks as she was approaching me and quickly stared up into the distance. I didn't know what she was looking at first, but then the sound came. The air seemed to get thicker and the sound in my ears turned kind of muffled with a faint and very high-pitched whistling sound. It was sort of like tinnitus, if you understand what I'm trying to explain. Above the trees and sat hovering was a large silver disc, just hanging there in midair, silent. It was maybe 500 or so yards away and just there. We didn't see it coming. We didn't hear it. It was just there all of a sudden. We were all just standing there, staring at it, fascinated to start with, but that soon changed. The disc was between 50 to 70 feet in diameter, maybe, and perhaps 10 feet in height, thinner towards its edges. It had 2 flashing lights on the underside that were alternating between emitting slow red and green pulses. I had never seen anything like it.
Hannah had initially sent me this story several months ago, but seeing her in person recall the story, I could see that the emotional impact it had on her was significant. She gazed into the near distance as she described the craft and the events of that night, slightly teary-eyed. Hannah described how there were no windows on the craft and how it was unlike anything that she had ever seen before. Yet she felt like she knew what it was almost right away, even at her young age.
My mom came over and grabbed me by the hand. I could feel her shaking a little. My grandfather started walking towards the thing to see if he could get a better look. He told us guys to hang back, but my grandmother told him to step back with us. She was so scared you could hear it in her voice. Fireworks continued to crackle in the valley and light up the sky, but the disc didn't move. All of a sudden, I remember hearing what sounded like a distant metallic clicking noise. The air was still thick. I felt like everything was slower. Everything around us felt sort of muted. And then the lights on the disc starting flashing quicker, brighter. I mean like really bright. Then the disc began to lower, slowly and silently going down. I couldn't tell if it was lowering into the trees or into the lake on the other side. I just remember my grandfather telling my mom to take me inside the house. The disc lowered out of sight on the other side of the live oaks. I was terrified by this point.
The next thing Hannah recalls is being sat on the couch in her family living room. Her mom was in the chair opposite with her eyes closed, and her grandmother was in the adjacent armchair also with her eyes closed. Hannah was confused. Had she been asleep, she thought? Where was Grandad? Had she had a nightmare perhaps?
This is where things get really strange for me. It's still so difficult to try and put all of this into words. I tried to wake my mother and grandmother up, but they were out, like completely unresponsive. But I shook my mom. I think I was in a frantic panic. I had tears falling down my cheeks, but my memories are kind of subdued and hazy. I ran to the back door and flung it open. I could see my granddad walking through the yard toward me. A huge wave of relief flooded over me. My grandfather would know what was going on. He would make everything all right. But he was walking with someone. There was another man with him. They weren't talking. They were just kind of walking together, toward the house. My grandfather and the man walked past me into the house, my granddad scruffling the top of my head as he walked past. He sat at the kitchen table and the other man sat opposite him. The man was dressed all in black trousers, a black shirt, and smart black shoes. He was pale and bald, but gave me a very slight smile. The man spoke gently to my grandfather. He said, "When you are ready, Joe, in your own time."
Hannah's memory of this strange event is somewhat eerie. She doesn't know who the quiet man is that had come to her home with her grandfather, and her only memory prior to this is of her grandfather heading into the woods to see where the weird disc had landed. There is a broken quality to what she recollects. Following this, she says she remembers her grandfather talking to the quiet man, but she can't remember what her grandfather was saying. She also remembers realizing that her mother and grandmother had now come around and woken up. Hannah's mother sits down close to Hannah's grandfather and links arms with him as he talks to the quiet man, while she vaguely remembers her grandmother making tea. Hannah tells me how her memories of that night from that point on are almost like a muddy third-person dream. She can see her grandfather talking, but can't hear him. No one else says anything, but everyone looks calm and subdued. Hannah stands in the corner, confused and placid. And then suddenly, Hannah's back in her room, and it's morning.
I heard like my mom calling my name. I had woken up still fully clothed, wearing the same outfit from the night before. I awoke on top of my bed sheets too, kind of like I was placed there, rather than getting into bed myself. I wish I could remember what I said or asked my mom when I went downstairs for breakfast, but I honestly have no recollection anymore. I think I was too confused and just thankful really that things were back to normal. I do recall that my family never really spoke about that night with me, and I'm not sure if I ever asked who the quiet man was, although it wasn't the last time I saw him.
So very, very bizarre. What did Hannah and her family experience? Maybe it was just one of life's strange events. A simple explanation made all the more creepy by the broken memories that Hannah has retained. Perhaps a shared hallucination, a sort of temporary folie à deux. Then, a few weeks after that night...
So my grandfather and I were hiking in the woods behind our house. He regularly went for walks there, to keep fit mostly, but he loved the outdoors in general. Think countless camping trips as I grew up, that kind of thing. We had walked through the trees and came out the other side next to the lake. At the edge of the water, just past the tree line, we came across 5 round holes in the ground. They were spaced out in a sort of pentagon shape. The holes were about the size of a wheel off of a car, and they were deep. Really deep. My grandfather poked down one of the holes with a stick. He couldn't reach the bottom, so he tossed a pebble down. We couldn't hear it hitting the bottom either. My grandfather made a vague comment about why the hole hadn't let in water, given its close proximity to the lake and the holes plunging deeper than the water table. I think I asked why there would be a table in the hole or something. Anyway, my grandfather told me to stand back from the holes. He was quite stern in insisting that I not stand amongst them. Like I was not to stand within the middle of the group of holes no matter what. I ended up going down to the shoreline and throwing pebbles in the lake as my granddad gathered branches and leaves to cover over the holes, so other people wouldn't fall in, he said. As a little girl, I just shrugged this off. although I question it now. In the days and weeks that followed, my grandfather would go out to the holes daily. He would say that he was going on his daily hike. But I knew where those hikes were taking him. He wouldn't let me come with him after that first time, and I have no idea what he was doing out there. I would give anything to be able to have gone with him. I might not have so many questions now.
So a few months later, Hannah is getting ready for Santa Claus. It's Christmas 1990, and Hannah finds herself without anxiety for the first time in months. She's able to relax, enjoy the festive season, and play like every other child should. On Christmas Eve night, her mother tucks her into bed. It's 9 p.m. and a little earlier than she would normally go to bed, but she's excited for the big day to arrive. Downstairs, Hannah can hear her grandparents chattering away, and the television is playing Christmas movies. She snuggles into the warm bed and begins to drop off to sleep. All of a sudden, there is a bright flash. Well, no, it's more sustained than that. A bright light that shines through all the windows and around the doorway. It lit up the room like it was daylight. It startled the hell out of Hannah, and she sprang upright in bed. Her anxiety returned immediately. The light vanished, and all was dark and quiet again. You could hear a pin drop.
I slowly climbed out of bed, putting my bare feet on the cold hardwood floor. Then I crept as quietly as I could to the doorway. I was trying not to put my full body weight on each floorboard. It was silent, and I felt the need to maintain that silence as best I could. I don't know why. Then it happened again. That sound. Everything went muffled with a faint and sustained high-pitch whistling. I felt in that slow-motion place again, but it was my surroundings that were in slow motion, even though I could move at normal pace. My breathing got faster, and I could feel my heart racing. I thought it was going to come out of my chest. So I crept out of my bedroom and snuck across the hall to the top of the stairs. Then I crouched down so that I could see what my family were doing downstairs without them seeing me. It was always a prime spot to overhear gossip and things that I shouldn't hear from my family when I was a kid. I ducked down. I couldn't see my mom anywhere, but the strange thing in that moment was my grandmother. She was stood in the window, just staring out, totally unflinching and motionless. My grandfather was sat in the armchair behind her. He was sat leaning forward, listening contently because sat opposite him, once again, was the quiet man. He was dressed as before, in all black. I broke out in a cold sweat as all the memories of the 4th of July came flooding back. Just the sight of the quiet man made my stomach churn and spin. I was scared at the whole strange series of events again, petrified even. Something wasn't right, and I didn't know what was happening. I was completely out of control in that moment. I watched on as the quiet man reached over and handed my grandfather something. It looked like glass or a crystal or something. It was triangular or pyramid-shaped. It wasn't very big, maybe half the size of an iPhone, maybe. My grandfather tucked it into his shirt pocket, and they continued to talk very quietly in whispered tones. My grandmother still standing in the window, frozen. There was a moment during the conversation where my grandfather got up and went to the kitchen. It was at this point that the quiet man slowly turned and looked right up at me, and winked. I was startled. I quickly pushed back and ran into my room. I remember clearly thinking, "It's okay, don't be afraid," over and over. But it wasn't me thinking it, if that makes sense. It was an intrusive thought, almost like my subconscious was trying to convince me that everything was going to be okay. But I remember a feeling of calm coming over me, deep relaxation and serenity. So I fell back on my bed and just lay there, looking up at the ceiling for what felt like hours. But then there was another hugely bright light that filled the room with daylight again. I felt sad and I didn't know why. But when I rolled over to the window next to my bed, I saw my grandparents in the backyard hugging each other. They were staring into the sky. When I looked up, the sky above was filled with dancing lights. Red, purple, green, yellow, all darting about in zigzags and random shapes. They quickly faded to nothing, like they slowly dissolved into the night.
Okay, So who is this man that keeps visiting Hannah's grandparents? And what are the lights that seem to accompany him? I think it's easy to jump to conclusions, but let's surmise. Occam's razor is a principle often attributed to 14th century friar William of Ockham. It was him that coined that if you have two competing ideas to explain the same phenomenon, you should prefer the simpler one, as that is 9 cases out of 10 the likeliest of reasonable outcomes. It's leaned on heavily in the fields of science, mathematics, and investigation. It might be convenient to lean into the thought that this whole episode is down to extraterrestrial phenomenon, but what is far more likely an explanation? So, I put it to Hannah that on the surface, an initial impression would tell me that the phenomena might be psychological. So much of her story is tied with broken memories, feeling unclear and in an altered state, and also full of instances where people in Hannah's life behave out of character or even behave in a non-human fashion. I thought Hannah might be reluctant to accept this, or certainly reticent, but she wasn't. In fact, she was open to the suggestion. For her, she just wanted an explanation, as it's something that has haunted her since childhood. You heard Hannah say herself at the start of this episode that she doesn't believe in extraterrestrial life, or that extraterrestrials are visiting Earth. I responded that the US government does. In recent months, the government have held congressional hearings on the matter, and released video footage of craft that they cannot explain that was, they say, directly interacting with United States military vehicles. Hannah was somewhat familiar with this. She admitted that she had seen the news discuss the video footage. She wasn't aware about the congressional hearings, however. The United States government, she says, admit to there being phenomenon, but they themselves don't know what that phenomenon is, right? Correct, I say. She replies coyly, then they're no different to me. They're in the exact same situation. They are witness to something strange that they cannot explain. That doesn't mean it's aliens. Hannah is, in my opinion, entirely right on this. For me, it's a huge positive to have travelled 5,500 miles and meet someone who isn't a nut. God knows how many people out there would be adamant at this stage in our conversation that this was the work of aliens, end of. Quote, "You weren't there, man. You don't know what I saw," unquote.
I reached out to you as you were someone I thought would listen, non-objectively, and maybe even suggest some possibilities of likely outcomes that weren't too fantastic.
I like to think that I have stepped up to the plate with that. If it is a psychological phenomenon, I tell her, it could be one of several possibilities. Firstly, it could be deep-rooted parental issues with your grandparents. Even if you feel you love them entirely, there can still be unresolved problems from your childhood that you don't attribute to them on the surface. But internally, they are there. The subconscious is more powerful than we give it credit for. It knows us better than we do. Could these be abandonment issues, possibly? A trauma response, maybe? At least from a positive angle, it doesn't appear to be an abuse response. The abandonment angle could come from your father, I suggest. He wasn't in your life, am I correct?
He left before I was born. My parents got divorced, and my mother never heard from him again. They were teenagers. I don't blame him. But I don't want a relationship with him either.
There, I suggest. And I bet your grandfather tried to measure up and ensure that he was there in his place. Oh, most definitely, Hannah replies. There is, of course, the night terror angle too, and a stress or depression response within the psyche. What was your mother most worried about when you were younger? I asked Hannah. Money was usually an issue, Hannah said. Mum was a single mother after all, but we got by. Children often wear their parents' problems, even when the parents think they are doing a good job of shielding the child from their issues. They often permeate into the child's awareness through a non-linear or verbal routes. I also mentioned the possibility of night terrors too. A night terror is essentially a sleep disorder which causes deep feelings of panic or dread within the person experiencing them. They occur in the initial stages of NREM sleep, or non-rapid eye movement sleep. Now, rapid eye movement is a phase within the human sleep cycle where rapid movements from left to right of the eyes is accompanied by full body, low muscle tone, which causes the sleeper to dream vividly. It's during this phase of sleep where your dreams are generated. NREM is the hours prior to this phase as the sleep cycle builds. NREM can last longer than REM sleep, especially in children under 12. Night terrors are classified as NREM-related parasomnias from a scientific standpoint. Hannah was certainly in the category that fit all of the characteristics when she experienced her July 4th and Christmas Eve experiences. If we are to speculate, of course. Now, we also can't rule out good old-fashioned vivid dreams, though Hannah is quick to dismiss this option, and interestingly, only this option, given how real it all felt to her, and how she underwent this experience on several occasions.
When I was 14, we started getting calls to the house. My grandparents were getting them at their place too. When we would answer them, there was no one at the other end. Sometimes it was just faint static. Other times it was just silence. These happened several times a day for around a month. It got to the point that my mother called the phone company to ask them to investigate and put a stop to it. Yes, we tried *69 when they came through, but the number who called was always untraceable. The phone company couldn't offer much help either, and they eventually changed our number for us. This put a stop to them, but only for a few days. Our number changed on the Monday. By Friday of the same week, they had started again. But this time, when I answered very faintly on the other end of the line, I could hear someone whisper, "Hello, Hannah." They hung up after saying this, again *69, but nothing. That last one really freaked me out. I was home alone at the time too, so that made me lock myself in my room until my mom got home. I swear my nerves were a wreck when I was that age. Later that night, I was doing homework in my room. A glimmer outside caught my eye. There were colored lights dancing around above the lake beyond the woods. The way they moved made it obvious they weren't normal aircraft. Besides, I knew those lights. I ran downstairs and onto the back porch to try and get a photograph, but as I opened the door, I could see my grandfather in the distance walking into the woods. I shouted after him, terrified at what would happen to him. I couldn't believe this was happening again. Then the woods lit up. The light was coming from within the woods, lighting up all the trees and setting a silhouette of my grandfather. As it did, along the tree line, I could see another man. It was the quiet man. He was stood facing me, and he slowly raised his hand and waved at me, which caused me to freeze. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what this meant. In that moment, a huge headache crippled me, causing me to fall to my knees. I could barely open my eyes or think straight. Just imagine the worst migraine you could imagine hitting you abruptly all of a sudden. It felt like it lasted for an age, but in reality it was probably around 2 or 3 minutes. Then, just as quickly as it came on, it went, vanished completely, and I was fine again. The dancing lights, the lights in the trees, the quiet man and my grandfather, they were all gone. There was nothing out there. Just silence and the gentle breeze blowing down the valley. I didn't know what to do at first. Should I get my mom? No, I ran over to my grandparents' house. I wanted to make sure my grandmother was okay. But when I burst in, both my grandmother and my grandfather were sat at the kitchen table drinking tea, like nothing had ever happened.
Hannah didn't see or experience the quiet man or any of the related phenomena after this, and her grandfather sadly passed away 2 years later, with her grandmother passing the year after that. Hannah says she always regrets not seeking answers from them before they died, but at the same time, she was always worried that the phenomenon could be her. Hannah owns and runs a bookshop in Portland these days, and thinks that if aliens, or at least the strange crafts that people are seeing, are genuine phenomenon, then they're far more likely to be from closer to home than from a galaxy far, far away. Something that I think I agree with her on, but that's for another episode. An interesting story tonight, guys. I apologise this episode is a day late. As you can probably tell from my voice, illness has struck and I seem to be slowly losing my voice. Hopefully I'll be ship-shape for the next episode in a few days. But in regards to tonight's show, as always, I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this one. I know I certainly have mine. Reach out via Instagram or our website. I can't wait to hear what you all think. Until next time, and more encounters from the United States. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show tonight. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform and subscribe to our show so that you never miss an episode. Our shows aren't sponsored by any company or corporation, so any support you can give us goes a long way in supporting the work that we do. From all of us here at Dead Souls, sleep tight.